Our next presenter is Dr. Ellen Rasidi, who is an avian veterinarian at the Australian Raptor Care and Conservation Incorporated. She's an avian and exotics veterinarian at Jurong Bird Park in Singapore and the Animal Referral Hospital in Homebush, New South Wales. Dr. Rasidi completed internship programs at the Gabbett Raptor Centre at the University of Minnesota and the Abu Dhabi Falcon Hospital in the United Arab Emirates. Drawing on her experiences from these facilities, she is focused on applying the techniques learned to raptor care in Australia, particularly in New South Wales.
Thanks.
And that's your laser, if you need that.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Is everyone nicely caffeinated now? Hopefully, good. I'm a bit of a wanderer, so I'm going to hold this. But so I wanted to, this is a bit of a follow-up talk from some data that was presented at the 2018 conference. Chiara Simonis, now Dr. Chiara Simonis, presented some of our proof of concept work. This is when we first started putting satellite trackers on wedge-tailed eagles, just to see what would happen. So first of all, just an acknowledgement of country to elders past and present. Our work obviously goes all the way around New South Wales, but just acknowledging and paying our respects to the elders past and present and extending that to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So I have been working with Australian Raptor Care and Conservation since its inception in about 2013. Now we are not, strictly speaking, a rehab group at the moment, but what we aim to do is try and support the rehab industry and the wildlife veterinarian sector with information about particularly our birds of prey. So one of our main parts of our mission statement is to advance and exchange our knowledge of raptors and improve their successful rehab and release. As we were just speaking on our table before, I'm sure we've all been in a position where there's been what I'd like to refer to as urban myths spread about within the industry. I remember 25 years ago when I saw my first raptor in care, someone said to me, "You've got to get it out within 2 weeks, otherwise it's never going to survive." I was like, really? 2 weeks? Seems a bit short. Surely, if we've got appropriate knowledge and appropriate facilities, they can last a lot longer, and they can survive, and we know that now. But we did notice that there's a big knowledge gap in this sector in wildlife rehabilitation. And one of the biggest problems I think we all realise now is that we don't know what happens to a lot of these animals once we let them go. We put in all this work, all this money, all this time and effort and heartache, and then we get the great hero shot of them going out in the wild, the few that do make it, and then what the hell happens? What happens after that? We just don't know. And the only way that this sector can really consolidate our techniques and do best practice, which we all want to do, is by actually knowing what happens to these birds or any animals once they're out in the wild. Basically, is what we're doing actually working? And so that's where we sort of come in. So I just wanted to start off with a bit of a story from Singapore. So I've been living in Singapore for the last 5 years. One of the great things about doing satellite tracking is I can do it from the comfort of my own home in a tropical country. So Singapore is on the Asian flyway. So we do get quite a few migratory birds sometimes coming through. Some of them land in Singapore and find nothing, and then they move on. So one of the birds that we that visited Singapore during COVID, when there was absolutely nothing else going on, was a cinereous vulture. Now, for those who don't know, cinereous vultures live sort of between Mongolia and Tibet. They're not really supposed to come down to Southeast Asia. Occasionally we'll get juveniles that get blown quite far off the migration path, so they have a dispersal range that is quite far out of their native range. It never comes down as far as Singapore. But this guy was drastically blown off course. He ended up in Singapore. He was obviously starving. He ended up in the Botanic Gardens. He couldn't get any lift. He ended up at the bird park. So we saw him, again, nicely masked up. He's a bloody big bird. He should weigh about 8.5, 9 kilos. Really sweet bird though. I mean, I know he was really sick and depressed, but really sweet bird. There was literally nothing wrong with him other than he was starving. So we kept him for about a week. We tried to release him. Singapore's a really flat country. There's nowhere for a vulture to get lift. So given it was COVID and there was absolutely nothing else going on, the newspapers were all over it. So these are my poor colleagues trying to release this bird. Everything we did was covered by the media. It didn't matter, how insignificant it was. Eventually, after 2 weeks, it was only in care for 2 weeks, we did actually manage to get this guy lifted. He actually made it into the air. It was a secret location. I think we ended up using a military base. But we got the hero shot. And that's what the media wants to see, right? The hero shot. Great story, great media coverage. We get the hero shot at the end. But what happened to the bird? 9 months later, we get a call from Malaysia, which is, if you don't know the geography of Singapore, it's right across the river. And this is where the bird was. He'd gone 7 kilometres. Now, this bird should have gone a couple of 1,000 kilometres back to his native range, and as far as I know, he is still living in the Sultanate's palace. So I think this is a really good indication of a story that looked like it went really, really well, but only because we didn't know what happened to it. So I actually begged the government to let me put a tracker on this bird. Because its range goes inside of China, I was not allowed. But if I had, we would have known. So that's basically why we do what we do, because we really want to know what happens to these guys. We want to close the loop on the rehabilitation process. So we want to know that what we do is worthwhile, that what we're doing is the right thing, and what we're doing actually works for these birds. And there are so many questions. And one of the things that I would like, my email address is at the end of this presentation. Please email me with questions that you would like answered, because I would love in the next couple of years to get as many of you guys involved in this project as possible. I want to put trackers on all of your birds of prey that you release, and potentially other animals as well. Once we get the licensing to extend this outside of New South Wales, and I want to be able to answer the questions that you guys have. The questions that I currently have, how long do they survive? Really basic question. Do they survive long enough to actually contribute back to the population? Do juveniles disperse normally? So one of the things we were looking at in New South Wales is if we're keeping juvenile birds of prey in care and we're aiming to release them at the time that they would normally disperse, does it matter where you release them? How far do they go? Nobody knows. We have some literature available for wild birds up until the point of dispersal. So we've had studies that show how much of their natal range they use. We don't really know how far they disperse. So that is one thing that we were hoping to answer. How long can you keep an adult in care? How long till it loses its territory, if it's got a territory? Can it establish a new one, and how far does it have to go? Not just birds of prey. Bree was just talking about kookaburras. How, can they re-establish a new territory? Does an adult with an established territory and mate return there and breed again? Or how long is it before they lose that and their partner goes off and finds someone else? What kinds of landscapes do they use? What kind of man-made resources? What kind of natural resources do they need? These are also things that will inform, policy, national parks, things like that. This is not just for us, this is for, management of the environment as a whole. And then one of the big questions is, does a bird released from human care, do they tend to hang around urban areas? Like, is there something that we're doing? Are we, not imprinting, but are we making them accustomed to urban areas too much? I'm sure there's another couple of hundred questions that could be answered as well, hopefully at the same time. So we decided to put trackers on birds. How do we do this? So most of you would be aware about, collar trackers for mammals. This is a quick release style that was used on mainland quokkas, I think. There's also these new wombat robot things that can go down wombat burrows. That is not a real wombat, that is a fake wombat, but someone has been doing that. I'm sure you've also seen the nature documentaries where they've got like little robots that like infiltrate colonies and stuff like that. Super cute. But this is basically what that is as well. These don't work for birds, obviously. So traditionally we've tracked birds with radio telemetry, which is pretty cool. and works quite well for small birds that live in a confined area. So colony birds, birds that don't really disperse very far, birds within a particular or limited range, because the problem is the tracker that you put on them needs to feed back to some sort of antenna. So these pictures are from a plover study run by Birds Canada, or Oiseaux Canada. But they actually have to put these satellite or these radio transmitters around the entire area of study. The advantage of using something like this, though, is that the actual trackers themselves can be really small. So they've demonstrated up on the top right by gluing it onto a dragonfly. So it's super tiny. Great. The disadvantage of using something like this, obviously, is that you're limited to a certain area. The other disadvantage is that the trackers do not self-charge. So you can't have like a solar-powered tracker or something like that. But they do work well for certain species. They do not work well for birds of prey. So what we use is a satellite tracker. So these, you don't need to go running around with your little antenna. It will ping to a satellite. So we were just saying before that each of our trackers, for every position that we get, every data download, it's triangulated by at least 3 satellites. These are solar powered, so they're designed to actually last for about 20 plus years. These are made in Germany, and what they started off using them for is for migrating storks. So they know that they will survive for 15, 20 years at this point. They'll tolerate birds migrating from Europe to Southern Africa and back again. They're obviously waterproof. They're pretty damn indestructible, which is good if you're going to put it on an eagle. They only weigh 25 grams, which is less than 1% of the bird's body weight. If we're talking about a large bird of prey like a wedgie or a white-bellied sea eagle, which is what we've got here. One of the limitations, though, is that they are solar powered, so they're not great for nocturnal birds of prey. I've still yet to find a really good tracker for owls, which is something that I really want to do in the next couple of years. But they do get really good results on these diurnal birds of prey, particularly ones that fly a lot. I do find that wedge-tailed eagles, because they're spending a lot of time on the ground, they don't charge as well. But all they need to do is basically spend some, half an hour in the sun, and they'll be back up to full charge again, which is good. But they do definitely have better staying power on the white-bellied sea eagles. These ones can be tail or back mounted, and I'll talk about why we use one over the other in a minute. They can also be used as radio telemetry as well. So if you get into a situation, as I did with a different project in Singapore, where the bird disappears into a mangrove forest, and you can't actually physically find the damn thing, you can go in with a radio antenna and actually try and triangulate it that way, and it's much more accurate. We haven't had to do that yet, but it is possible. So this demonstrates how we attach these. So we use a tail mount. Most people who do wild bird studies will use a backpack mount, and there's pros and cons to both. One of the reasons that you do use this tail mount is because we are dealing with birds coming out of rehab. So the last thing we want to do is put any additional stress on that bird. So we find that the tail mount works better. It's very well tolerated, and it doesn't come with any additional risks to the bird. So the advantages of doing a backpack style, so this is usually like just straps around the wing and across the chest, which it doesn't interfere with flying, but there are some risks of like abrasion wounds, like seatbelt wounds from these things. There's a group out of Canberra who is doing little eagles, so tracking wild little eagles, not birds that have come out of rehab, but they did find a couple of birds who did have entanglement or constriction injuries as well. But the advantage to having a backpack is that it's not affected by the molt. So you can leave that tracker on for years and years and years and years, as long as the straps last. And so you can get quite a long period of data, which is a benefit. The tail mount, unfortunately, is only going to last as long as the feather lasts. So we mount them to the shafts of the tail feathers, just at the base. It can be covered by the covert, so it doesn't really bother the bird. The design, we actually follow a protocol that I think Murdoch University developed for Carnaby's cockatoos. And my reasoning is if a cockatoo will tolerate it, an eagle's going to easily. There's also no risk of entanglement. So it goes straight onto the feathers. There's no straps or anything like that to irritate the bird. So this is a little eagle with a backpack style on, and you can see the antenna sort of sticks straight out the back. And this is one of our sea eagles. You can see the antenna still comes out the tail, but one of the questions that someone asked previously was, does it actually affect mating if they have a backpack on? I don't think it would, but it might be irritating and get in the way. So what we generally do is, because we don't rehab our own birds, we collect birds from everyone else. So we try to aim to get the tracker on between 24 and 48 hours before the bird is actually released. So we've got some time to monitor how it's going to tolerate it. So the deal is we need to know sort of what methods we used in its rehab, how it's gone, just basically a rehab history or medical history. So we can collect that data and correlate it with the other stuff. We do a full health check under general anaesthetic. So this is done in a veterinary practice. We do physical exam, we do full blood work, we generally take x-rays as well, just to make sure. So this is for the bird's benefit, to make sure it is like physically healthy, like clinically well for release as well. But it also enables us to gather some extra data. And Wildlife Health Network, I'm happy to share that stuff too. After the bird is woken up from anaesthetic, it spends at least 24 hours back with its carer being monitored. So what we're looking for is any sign of distress that the tracker is causing. Is the bird, trying to eat it, or is it just ignoring it? 99.9% of the time they ignore it. So this is us just sticking the tracker on, and that's sort of a close-up there, kind of a close-up. So the trackers we use, we take the central two tail feathers and we go right down to the shaft, so just above where it enters the skin, where you've got a nice bald bit, basically. We super glue the tops of the feathers to the tracker, and then we also suture it. So there's four loops at the corners of each tracker, and we just basically do a nice suture loop knot in there. And then normally that would be the end of the story. You release them, that's it. But that's not what we want the end of the story to be. So I wanted to just share with you one of our case studies today just to show you what we can actually do. So this bird, SE27, she never got a name, but SE27 is a bird who has essentially been monitored since she was born. So I don't know how many people are familiar with Eagle Cam. It's a live web feed of a nest, a white-bellied sea eagle nest at Homebush in Sydney. So they've been watching this nest, or BirdLife set up this camera, and they've been monitoring the nest since 2009. And this pair actually clutches at least once a year. They've previously been very successful with their kids in the past, but in the last probably 8 years, the chicks have had real trouble at the fledging and dispersal stage. So one of the main problems with where the nest is located, it's in Sydney Olympic Park, which is, beautiful and green, and it has great trees, and it's right on the river, and it's otherwise a great area. But it's also an area that's got about 7 hotels, hosts the supercars, a million different concerts and sporting events. I never go to those, but it's a really noisy urban place. It's also now a residential area. So there's a lot of the birds there that go along with residential areas. There's a lot of pigeons. So 90% of the diet of these birds is actually pigeon rather than any sort of seafood. There are a lot of corvids in the area that tend to mob the fledglings as soon as they're out of the nest. There's also a lot of noisy miners, and they're pretty bad with the mobbing as well. So the main problems that these guys have had, apart from the trichomonas from eating pigeons, is as soon as they try to learn how to fly, they get out of the nest onto the branch and they just get mobbed. So they end up on the ground. They haven't even properly fledged yet. They're not in the greatest condition because of their diet, and they usually end up in care. So I think for the past 3 years, every single chick out of that nest has ended up in care. So SE27 came into care in 2021, end of 2020. And she was in care at both Taronga Zoo and then at Southern Highlands Raptor facility, which was run by Raptor Recovery Australia at the time. And that has a massive circular flight aviary. So she was able to spend 4 of those 6 months basically free flying, learning how to hunt. She was fed like live fish and yabbies, so she got those skills up, which was really good. And then we put a tracker on her when she got to dispersal age. So she was fitted with the 25-gram tail-mounted tracker, as you saw earlier. Because she'd had problems, and there were known and existing problems in Homebush, we did not release her in her natal area. We were allowed to release her at a site in Ku-ring-gai National Park, which is about 40 kilometres northeast of the natal area. One of the reasons we picked that is because one of her oldest siblings, SE21, had been spotted in the area the year before. So we knew that not only did birds from her area end up there, but it was obviously a good place for sea eagles. So we've got a picture of her down in the, well, no, that is not actually her in the flight aviary, but that's an example of our flight aviary, and another pic of her tracker. So she was released after 6 months of care, 4 months in a flight aviary, and it was about the right time for dispersal of youngsters. So for us, that's a really important thing, because you expect the bird to be able to fly a long way. They're mentally and physically ready for, such a long flight, and territoriality is going to be much less of an issue. So the very first thing she did was fly 100 kilometers north, which is exactly what they're supposed to do, according to the 2 papers that are out there. But again, this is why we need more data, right? So the large eagles tend to sort of bounce around their natal area for 4-6 months, and then the first time they disperse, they generally go like huge distance, and during the next year, they'll sort of gradually make their way a bit closer back to the natal area, according to the 2 papers. But that's exactly what she did. So she zoomed straight off into the Central Coast, and then she probably spent like the first 3 weeks basically just exploring the area. And it was a really interesting thing to watch, because we had no idea what she was going to do. And she went up these little river valleys, and she went up the next river valley, and then she went around the coast of Lake Tuggerah. And we're like, oh, this is really cool. She seems to know what she's doing. So this is, again, the first couple of weeks, but without that sort of tail bit. So this is, on the bottom right, this is what we actually get from the satellite data directly, and then I just put it on a Google map because it's easier for me to look at. So you can actually see she follows all the waterways, and it really does look like every day she picks a place to go explore, she does her thing, and then she comes back to a familiar base at night. So this just sort of demonstrates what I end up doing with the data. So data gets fed in every day. We probably get depending on the charge of the tracker, we get between 10 and 30 pings every day, which gives us a really good picture about what that bird has done over the 24-hour period. We can then correlate that with local human activity. We can correlate it with local weather, temperature, all of those sorts of things. The tracker also gives us altitude, it gives us ground speed, it gives us which satellites it's pinging off. We can actually change the programming on these trackers to give certain information. We have found that just getting that basic stuff, though, gives us the best battery life. So altitude and speed seem to be the most important things, and then actually where this bird is at different times during the day. So I tend to export it into a Google map just so I can sort of see what she's done on different days and what she might be doing. And so every colour is a different day there. This was during May in 2022. And as you can see, this bird is basically spending her time all around Lake Macquarie and Lake Tuggerah, sticking to the coastal areas. And something that we've noticed, because we've tracked quite a few of these white-bellied sea eagles, and some from the same nest, like literally related birds, they all do something a bit different. So you'd think a sea eagle would go to the coast, or she'd spend her time, right on the coast like this girl did. Her little sibling, her little sister that we're tracking at the moment, does not like lakes. She prefers to spend her time in swampy areas, more inland, really different sort of locations, which I personally find quite interesting, that they have these differences in personality and preference. And they had exactly the same history. Born at the same time of the year, same problem, came into care, spent the same amount of time in care, rehabbed at the same facility, released at the same time, just different years apart. So that's what I spend my time doing in Singapore, stalking birds. But one of the other things I can do on Google Maps is actually see what the land use is. So I would look at the map on the left and go, okay, she's gone up near Stroud. She's followed the creek. That seems a very reasonable thing to do. Now, why has she gone up there? She doesn't normally spend time around that area. And then you go to the other Google Maps and you go, oh, what's that? What's that? It's a bloody chicken farm. Little shit. So this is also something that's interesting. So she grew up in a nest where her main diet is pigeons. When she was in care, she only got fed seafood. But she has gone back out and she's noticed a chicken farm and she's gone, yeah, that's a good idea. But the other thing I found quite interesting is that this is a really heavily wooded area, and she doesn't spend any time around that. She prefers open area around the waterway, which I guess is what you'd expect a sea eagle to do. So this is an example of the altitude. It's not truly altitude. As you see, it goes into negative area. It's the ellipsoid and some other geomorphological stuff I'm not going to explain, but it's basically height. So you can see how high she's flying on any given day, and you can see how fast she's flying on any given day. Don't get too excited about the first couple of months of data there. We were just playing with the settings. We didn't need that many settings going through the whole 9 months. So, but you can see that she's pretty consistent in how high she's flying, how often she's flying, how much. And if you correlate this data with where she's going on a map, the further she flies, the higher she flies, and the faster she flies, as you'd expect. So looking at her total range, so we tracked this bird for a total of 9 months, from the 1st of April to the 1st of January. So we've got a full 9 months worth of data, and this is basically her range. So this is in sort of Central Coast, New South Wales, if anyone's familiar with that area. So we've got Gosford down here, Newcastle here, and so we've got Lake Macquarie and Lake Tuggerah in this area, and she spent the majority of the 9 months there. What she would do is she'd make forays up further north and further inland, but she would always come back to this area. So this is sort of like her home range. And looking at that home range a bit more closely, so you can see exactly where she's spending a lot of time around the beaches, around the coasts. She never went over to the ocean coast. She always stayed on the lake coast, but all the way through this sort of lake system here. And then this was sort of more in the early part of her time out in the wild, where she was spending more time on the rivers. But she really did show a preference for freshwater, brackish lakes, which was quite interesting. So if we look at a bigger map, so her main home range is here around the lakes. She did spend some time. She'd only spend about a week at a time up in this northern area, and then she'd always come back to this area here. But just to sort of put things in perspective, this is her release site, which is about 80 kilometres south of where she ended up, and about 40 kilometres away from that is actually her natal zone. So this is where the nest was. So it's a fair distance. From the nest site to here is about 250 kilometres. From the bottom of her home range to the top of her home range is probably about 150. Now, I don't think we expected that large of a home range, but just so you know, that's a potential home range for a dispersing juvenile sea eagle. They need a lot of space. So what happened to her? So I said we tracked her until the 1st of January this year. So around Christmas, New Year's time, when everyone's super hungover, I see this. It's just a collection of pings all from the same area. And this is the last thing I want to see, right? Because I either think, oh, she's dead. Oh God, I'm going to have to send someone out there. So on the 1st of January, when everyone's hungover, I actually got someone to go out there. And bless the guy whose property this was, he was not expecting a bunch of bird nerds to turn up on his doorstep going, can we just check your backyard? We've dropped something. So luckily he was really sweet. He was a bit iffy because he had a lot of greyhounds on the property. I know. And he was feeding them raw meat and he was attracting eagles. So this is why SE27 ended up there, because there was a good supply of meat and there was also a lot of other sea eagles in the area. But we did find the tracker and it wasn't on a carcass. Yay. So she'd actually molted this off. This is what we want. This is the best outcome for us, is that the tracker falls off like it's supposed to. Okay, we only get 9 months of data, but we don't have a dead bird at the end of it. And from her behaviour beforehand, it looks like she was just moving through this area on the way somewhere else. So we're going to make the assumption that she's okay. So main lessons from SE27. So she was in human care for 6 months and she survived at least 9 months after that. So as long as you have appropriate housing and staging of rehab, so she was free flight for at least four out of the 6 months, and that her hunting skills were appropriate at the time of release. So she was fed live food, she knew how to catch it out of water. She was clearly catching stuff, not just chickens, after release. Her dispersal behaviour appeared normal, despite spending 6 months in human care and not being in the company of any other sea eagles. So normal dispersal behaviour. And we actually got to see her use of natural resources. So we know that this bird was favouring sort of small river and creek valleys, lake shores and islands, and preferred open wooded areas rather than forested areas. We also noted that she used the man-made conservation areas. So there's a whole lot of like little state parks in that area of New South Wales. She never stayed there for longer than an evening. She would use those as stop-offs if she was going somewhere else. So those areas are really useful for eagles, but maybe not for permanent residency. She did use man-made areas. She did spend quite a bit of time around, habitated beaches. Holiday areas is what I would call them in the Central Coast. She did visit chicken farms more than one occasion, unfortunately. After about 5 months, she seemed to really learn where they were. She never stayed too long. She'd hit them up and then go back somewhere else. So she was sorting that out. She did spend a lot of time around dams as well, so on properties rather than wooded areas. We couldn't determine whether she was interacting with any other eagles at the time, except for obviously, where we ended up finding the tracker. There were a lot of eagles in the area. They were all eating greyhound food. But we couldn't really determine any of that. But our future studies, so we are currently tracking this bird's sibling. We're about 5 months into tracking SE30, who is showing completely different behaviour. So she favours different areas. She hasn't discovered chicken farms 5 months in. She doesn't like the larger rivers. She doesn't like lakes. She likes swamps. She spends a lot of time in wetlands and swamps. She's got some really interesting information, which I hope to get out to you guys shortly as well. We do actually have our licence and ethics approvals renewed in New South Wales for a further 5 years. So we would love to get more people involved. I want to stick trackers on your birds, if anything. We would also like, when we can get some smaller trackers, we would like to start tracking peregrine falcons, because one of our big questions is, do you need the crayons flying, or can you get away with just using free flight in aviaries? It's a big question for New South Wales at the moment. And also obviously compare dispersal and territorial behaviour of wild birds as well. This is all very red, so I'm going to wind it up. What I did want to tell you guys is that we are rolling out a new satellite tracking system at the end of next year. The trackers will only be between 2 and 5 grams. So smaller birds, I welcome smaller birds. At the moment, I am limited to the larger eagles, or birds that are at least over 1.5 kilos. But very soon we will be able to track pretty much anything you want for a very small fee, but the cost will be coming down as well. And we're more than happy to help with fundraising. So I need you. these are my contact details. Feel free to hit me up. Do not call me. That is an international number. WhatsApp me or email. Just let me know if you're interested. I want to answer your questions. I want to get you involved. Thank you.
Thanks,